thank you very much. I'm realising that today has been a long day, but I'm going to tell you that as a teacher, I'm feeling rather chuffed because we've listened to two excellent keynotes and we've all spoken about slightly different things. But as I was listening to Bridget and to Jessie, I could see synergies with some of the things that I wanted to talk about today. So as a teacher, that pleases me because there is some sequence and continuity in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. And someone talked about the messages that you might take home and what that might mean in terms of reflecting and action. So I'm hoping that I might be able to touch on some of those messages again so that we've all got a clear idea of some of the key messages here, and you can think about then what's most relevant to you and your context at this point in time. So I'm going to switch focus now just a little bit, and what I really want to look at is the professional work of teachers and educators in early childhood education and care. And I've had a bit of a play with the terminology here because we're talking about ecological systems here, and I want to put teachers and educators at the centre. We put children at the centre all of the time, and that's very right. We need to do that. But when we're planning for ecosystems and when we're planning for early childhood education and care systems, which is my particular interest, we actually need to put the teacher and the educator at the middle. And I'm going to talk with you a little bit about why I think that's important and some of the things that we're thinking about in Australia. So before we begin, one of the things I want to do firstly is to thank Alfredo and Professor Kerry Lee for inviting me here. I met Professor Lee and Alfredo probably just during COVID, I think, so all of our interaction was online. It feels like we know each other, but in actual fact we hadn't met face to face until we came here a couple of days ago. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I've been to Hong Kong once before, and I stayed predominantly around Kowloon and Hong Kong Island and didn't have opportunity to come out to see the beauty of the natural areas. So I'm going back with new knowledge and appreciation of Hong Kong being more than a fabulous skyline of modern architecture, but also thinking about the rolling hills and the beauty of nature, and I'm very appreciative of that. I've been spending a bit of time learning about the local culture, enjoying food and a glass of wine with colleagues, and I wanted to share just a little bit of our culture with you. I'm going to bring a little bit of Australian culture here too. So in Australia, one of the things that we're particularly proud of is that we have one of the oldest living continuous cultures in the world. The culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which has been continuous for more than 65,000 years. Now in Australia, we haven't always appreciated that, and we haven't always thought of that as our collective heritage. But we are working really hard towards reconciliation. And one of the things that we do in support of reconciliation is when we're gathering at meetings such as this, we acknowledge the First Nations owners of the lands where we're actually meeting. So I want to acknowledge where I work at the Queensland University of Technology and where I prepared this presentation, and that's on the lands of the Turrbal and the Yuggera people. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. I also wanted to share with you some beautiful Aboriginal art. This particular painting I thought was really perfect for today. It's painted by a friend and a colleague called Auntie Denise Proud. And Auntie Denise Proud shared the story of this. Would you like to hear the story? Because I think it's relevant to the work that we're doing today. All right, let me see if I can generate. Auntie Denise is a much better storyteller than I am, but I will see if I can channel her thinking. So we have ants all over this picture. And in the picture, the ants are the women in the community. So the women in the community are the first caregivers, the nurturers of the children, the people who are doing all of the work for the children to give them a good start and a good future. And the men are supporting the work of the women. The ants are moving all around these lanes, and that's designed to show the connections across the community. that in Aboriginal culture, community and being with other people and families is very important. And so you can see that the ants are moving all around the community and connecting. The blue circle here is the Early Childhood Centre. And that's the point where everyone comes together. You can see the lines going around, the spiral lines in the middle of the blue centre. That's to show us that we've got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges and Western knowledges coming together. And we're valuing those and we're sharing both of those in the centre. And the little black, what would you call them, U's, the upside down U's, do you know what they are? They're people's bottoms. And they're sitting down at the early childhood service, all of the children, the families, and the community members, and they're all coming together as equals, sitting at the early childhood service, listening, learning, and playing together. And that's a strong community with the early childhood service at the heart of that community. I think that gives us something to think about, don't you? All right. As I said, I'm going to be switching focus today, and I'm going to be looking a little bit more closely at the people who are providing early childhood education and care services. And when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about the provider, the owner of the service, or the operator of the service. I'm thinking about the leaders and the teacher leaders. And I'm thinking about the educators and teachers working in the service as well. I'm going to follow a broad sort of outline here. I want to give you a little bit of context because I'm talking about the Australian early childhood education and care context. So I want you to remember that quality in early childhood and education and care has a contextual element to it. As Bridget was saying before, we can't just think about the same things everywhere we go. We have to think about culture and context in this area. So I want you to think that this is my culture and context, and you can take away what you think is relevant for your particular work context. I'm going to draw on a program of research that I've been working on for around about 10 years with colleagues to identify some of the challenges that we're currently experiencing in terms of the workforce in early childhood education and care. And I know that some of these challenges are shared by other countries. I know certainly across the UK and in some parts of Europe, but I'm less familiar with Hong Kong and with China. So again, I will leave it to you to critically reflect and think about what's similar and what's different. I'm going to be sharing a little bit about some of the research that we've undertaken, and I'm going to also share with you some of the possible ways forward, including some of the policy solutions that Australia is currently considering. Now, I need to say, and it's my end of chapter disclaimer and limitations of my presentation, we don't have all of the answers by any means. We're still working on that. We've had more than a decade of absolute neglect in this space, and so we can't make up for that quickly. A lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about today are quite recent things, and there is research and other strategies in progress, but it's too early for any real evidence. So I guess I'm going to use that as my disclaimer to say we're going to share some ideas today, but again, we might have to come back in a couple of years' time to report on the outcomes. And ultimately what I want to do is think about the work ecosystem from the perspective of teachers and educators. Does that sound like a plan? All right. So a little tiny bit about the context in terms of early childhood education and care in Australia. So today, when I'm talking about it, I'm mostly talking about services that are catering for children in prior to school settings. We have a mixed market. So we have a range of providers. We have government providing services. We have community groups providing services, generally not-for-profit services. And around about 50% of our system is also provided by private for-profit businesses. We have a range of different size services. We have some very large services that operate multiple service centres and services. But the vast majority of our early childhood services are quite small, operated maybe one or two centres. so quite small. We have three main sorts of service types. We have early childhood centres, so preschools, kindergartens and long daycare services. We have home-based services, which are family daycare services, where an educator works on their own in their home with a small group of children. And we also have services for school-aged children, so prior to school, before school care, after school care and vacation school care, so when families are needing those extended hours. We've had growth over a period of time, and early childhood education and care is used by most Australian children. So around about 50% of 1-year-olds attend an early childhood service, and around about 90% of 4-year-olds attend an early childhood service. And we have a significant workforce there, and we're trying to grow that workforce. So let me tell you just a little bit about the workforce. Now I wonder how these characteristics sit against yours. Would you be surprised to know that most of the Australian early childhood workforce is female? That doesn't surprise you? So a large number of women working in early childhood education and care. The average age of teachers and educators at the moment is around 37, so a little bit more mature. And one of the things that researchers are interested in Australia is what that means in terms of the life course and the employment and support of women who are going to have families and who perhaps have stopped working full-time and maybe are coming back full-time, of women who might have new or renewed career aspirations because their children are a little bit older and they're ready to engage with further study. So thinking about what that workforce means. We have some diversity, so 3% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teachers and educators, and around about 28% of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. But there's a really strong focus at the moment on strengthening the diversity of the workforce and strategies to be able to do that, because there's a commitment to know that the workforce, the early childhood workforce, is reflective of the diversity in the community. Why is that important? Bridget pointed to one of her videos of, was it Cantonese, the lady speaking Cantonese, and Bridget asked, what do you see here that you think would represent quality? And when Bridget posed that question, I was looking at that and I saw the educator talking in Cantonese to a young child. And to me, that's quality, because the educator is talking in the home language of the child, and we know how important that is for beginning literacy. So I think that, you know, increasing the diversity of the workforce is really important. In terms of qualifications, Australia has a mixed model. We have educators. Now, I probably should explain the actual terminology that I'm using here as well. We talk about teachers and educators. So we have educators who lead programs and work directly with children, and educators are required to have a vocational qualification. So an educator who is leading a group of children generally holds a 2-year vocational qualification, and they would work with an assistant educator who generally holds an entry qualification, which is a 1-year qualification. But we also have degree qualified teachers working in early childhood education and care, and we're trying to grow the number of teachers that are working there. And those teachers hold 3- and 4-year degrees. At the moment, though, you can see that only 11% of our workforce holds a degree, and it's been sitting flat at that level for quite some time. And that's because we have some challenges that we really need to be addressing. So one of the problems with our system, and I'm going to use the word system very loosely here, is that it's developed over time and it's been quite fragmented. So my interest is policy, and I like to think about things from a systems level, because that's where you can affect scale change, isn't it? But in Australia, we've really had this long history, and it's been a fragmented approach because we've got 8 different states and territories, and all of the 8 states and territories until quite recently were operating on their own and differently. And we also had competing priorities. So we used to move between, preschool education and the need for childcare and different systems and different funding models, and nothing that was cohesive or thinking of the system as a whole. But we have had some improvements over recent years, and these are some of the things that we're particularly proud of in terms of moving our system forward and supporting a better ecosystem for teachers and educators. So in 2012, we introduced a national quality system. And that was very important because it moved all of those different states and territories focusing on themselves to actually thinking about a national approach. The National Quality Framework set new quality standards, raised expectations in terms of qualifications of staff. And it also introduced 2 national learning frameworks. One of the ones that I'm talking about particularly today is the Early Years Learning Framework. So setting some pedagogical principles and practices, identifying those as evidence-informed and promoting the importance of those, and also identifying 5 high-level learning outcomes, not prescriptive, but thinking about what we think is important for all children in the important early years. We also have seen a commitment to universal preschool. So we were doing fairly well in that area, but it wasn't consistent across Australia. And we've actually got a commitment now to ensuring 1 year of universal preschool for all children in the year prior to school entry. Over recent years, we've also seen a commitment from some states and territories to 3-year-old kindergarten. So 2 years of preschool education for children prior to school entry. And very recently, in fact, in progress, we've got a very large inquiry. It's a Productivity Commission inquiry that is actually looking at how Australia might move towards a path of universal access to early childhood education and care. And instead of just focusing, as we have done for quite some time, on preschool children, this particular commission is recommending universal access for up to 30 hours per week for children from birth to 5. So really recognising the importance of working with toddlers and providing access to toddlers and infants for quality early childhood education and care. And the focus of this is very much about the right of the child to access high quality, inclusive early childhood education and care. Whereas in the past, there's been quite a lot of focus on childcare to support parents in the workforce. Now that's very important, but from a policy perspective, the shift to think about children and their right to early learning opportunities is a very important shift and one that we support. So those are some achievements that we're very proud of, but we've got a long way to go, and we've got some challenges to that, and most of the challenges relate to workforce issues. So I mentioned that my particular area of research is around workforce development, and certainly looking at some of the issues that we've got in terms of needing more educators. So I could put out a job advertisement right now and say that if you're looking for somewhere else to work, Australia needs educators and early childhood teachers. In fact, this is the estimate, the most recent statistical estimate, which is telling us that we're needing around 16,000 educators and at least 8,000 teachers by the end of next year. And I need to say that we haven't come close to meeting that. And I also need to say that those particular statistics are out of date, because with the announcement of 3-year-old kindergarten in some states and growth, we actually need more. So if you're looking for a nice sunny spot to live and to work, come to Australia, because we need more early childhood teachers and educators. Now, as I said, this is an area that we really haven't done particularly well in for a while, because it's always been seen to be something that is a matter for employers and their employees. We haven't had a national focus on the workforce, and we haven't had national approaches to support the development of the workforce. But this has come to a head because at the moment we have these aspirations to do much better and to improve quality and to grow access and inclusivity, and we haven't got the teachers and educators to be able to do that. So, a couple of questions and some ideas that we've been working on in terms of research. So one of the things that we're thinking about at the moment is that one of the challenges in early childhood education and care in Australia is that it's not always thought of as professional work. There's been this ongoing debate, and because we've had this split system where we've got some services which are seen to be more about education and some services which are seen to be more about childcare, we've had a problem in terms of the recognition of the work. And I don't think Australia is isolated in that regard. There are different ways of thinking about teachers in different settings. There's also been a really strong focus in workforce research across the globe on professionalisation of the workforce. As Bridget pointed out, we know that the relationships and interactions and experiences that children have in their early years are the key determinants of their health, learning, development and well-being at that time and going into the future. And we also know that one of the key determinants then of that are the teachers and educators who are working with the children. So very important for us to be thinking about the nature of the work that these folk are doing. So if I said to you, is early childhood education and care a profession? Let me, and I want honesty here too. Do you think that early childhood education and care is a profession? Hands up if you do, hands up, hands down if you don't. Hands up, I can't see one. Okay. Who's not sure if it's a profession? Does it fit a profession? Let's have a think about it. I was involved in a paper looking at this. We actually did some research to think, what is it that makes a profession? And then what do educators think? Do they see themselves as professionals? So in terms of what makes an early childhood profession, if we have a look at some of the work of people like Evetts, who looked at occupational professionalism, she talks about the fact that for someone to be part of a profession, they usually have specialised knowledge. They've completed a robust training program, education and training program to build that knowledge. They are qualified in that respect. There's a sense of collegial relations in a profession, that people work together, as Jessie was talking about, collegial relations. And there's also a sense of professional autonomy, that because these colleagues have got knowledge and skills and they're working in different contexts, that they need to exercise professional judgment and discretion in practice. And those things come together to create a shared professional identity. In a profession, there's also usually a code of conduct, maybe some quality standards, maybe a registration authority. So some kind of organisation that's controlling entry to the field. So making sure that people are qualified and have the specialised knowledge and controlling entry to the field. And that creates a protected professional identity. Not anyone can join it. It's only the professionals who are qualified and able to join. And finally, some colleagues talk about social and ethical responsibility. The fact that it's expected that professionals will always work in the best interests of their clients and the community and the profession, that they'll do what's right in that regard. And that by doing that, there's a sense of trust, with professionals, and there's a sense that they're working in the area of public good, that what they're doing is not just for themselves, it's for the benefits of society. So I'm going to ask you again, do you think that early childhood teachers and educators sit within a profession? Do they meet these requirements? Do you think they might be on their way, perhaps? One of the things that we did in a recent study was to actually ask educators that question. So in this particular study, we were looking at 98 educators. We did biographical interviews with those educators. They were working in 13 different early childhood centres, and those centres were in quite different communities, so different contexts. And one of the things we talked with them about and asked them was, do you think that you're a professional? It was really interesting because unanimously they said, yes, we do think that we're a professional. And we said to them, why? Why do you think you're a professional? And there were three main reasons that they gave. Firstly, and importantly, they said, our work is meaningful and important. We know that what we do with children is important and has impact. They also talked about being qualified, that they had studied for a period of time and that they held a qualification, and they thought that made them a professional. They also talked about community opinion. And this one was tricky because sometimes they would say, yes, in the community my work is regarded well and I'm thought of as a professional. But often they would say, in actual fact, the community doesn't understand what I'm doing and doesn't recognise the professional nature of the work that I'm doing, and that makes me sad and makes me feel like I'm not valued. So we've got some very strong thinking about the factors that are influencing their sense of professionalism. In that particular study, we then went back over the biographical interview transcripts and we looked for the ways that the educators and teachers were describing their work. And that was quite interesting and has some lessons, I think, for those of us who are working in teacher education and professional development and leading services. Because what we found was that most of the educators talked about their work in very simple terms. Most of the educators talked about their work in terms of caring, in terms of the physical and emotional labour of the work that they were doing. Some of the educators talked about their work in very technical terms, linking to curriculum and standards and regulations. Basically said, we're implementing the curriculum or we're following the national quality standard, but they didn't talk any more about things. Just under half of the educators and teachers that we interviewed described their work in pedagogical terms, talked about not just what they were doing, but gave some insights into their thinking and why they were doing that. Now, I think if we're growing a professional workforce, we need to be equipping teachers and educators to be able to share what they're doing and why they're doing, which I think you again, Jessie, were talking about the what and the how. So I think it's very similar, sharing a little bit of the thought behind the professional nature of the work that they're doing. And I think that it's the role of those of us who are working with teachers and educators and supporting them through their careers to build that knowledge and those skills. It's important. And that's not to mean that you're going to be using large academic terms. Teachers and educators need to be able to speak to a variety of audiences, telling children why they're doing things in particular ways, telling parents why they're doing things in particular ways. But it's the skill of being able to share that. Okay, probably not going to surprise you because I confessed at the InSU that I'm actually a policy nerd because I have a background in policy. But I'm going to say to you that in terms of growing the workforce and supporting the workforce, that policy has got a very important role to play. And in particular, regulations and quality standards and assessment and rating processes all come together to provide support if they are evidence-informed and set correctly. So again, some research that we were involved in recently, and I was working with Professor Philip Lee on this particular paper because we did some research together looking at quality improvement in the Australian early childhood education and care system. And in this particular study, another national study, we were focused on long day care services, and we were looking at what were the factors that were actually assisting services to move from a lower quality rating to a higher quality rating, and was the engagement with that particular policy system supporting improvement. And what we did was look at that and then look at the literature about what makes regulation and quality standards effective. And this is what we found. We found that regulations and quality standards are beneficial if they focus on process quality. So we don't want them to be prescriptive and only focusing on structural elements. We need them to be focusing on the relationships, the interactions, and the experiences that are happening in services. And what's happening between the adults in the services, the children in the services, and both of those groups together on a daily basis. We want regulations and quality standards not to be telling educators what to do, because quality isn't a recipe that can be reproduced in different places, but we're looking for them to draw on evidence, current evidence, to talk about what's important in terms of supporting quality. So again, thinking about perhaps the class system and some of the things that it offers us in terms of identifying quality determinants that we can be working on to improve the quality of services. We don't want regulation and quality standards to be purely about compliance. We want it to be about learning and growth. And one of the key things that we need are policies that really engage educators and teachers and providers in critical reflection, self-evaluation, and a commitment to continuous quality improvement. It's not just about someone coming through the door. I think we talked about the person wanting to have the day's sort of quick training to be able to support compliance checks. We actually need people to be doing that year in, year out in a genuine way. As researchers, it's not surprising, but in policy, it's equally important that we're using data to improve quality. So gathering the information that we have got about quality and what's happening in our services, and using that to think we need to put more training in here. We need initial teacher education providers to be focusing more on this. We need some professional development opportunities to build these particular skills. So all working together. And very much important is making sure that the system engages with parents and children. These are our key consumers, clients of early childhood education and care, and they should have voices, and we need to be engaging with them and listening to them when we're talking about policy and quality improvement. Oops. So we've looked at some things around professional recognition. We've looked at the importance of policy and evidence-informed standards to support the work of teachers and educators and quality service provision. But I'm going to put to you that money matters. And that's certainly one of the things that the research that we've been doing in Australia over an extended period of time has shown us. So in our fragmented system, there is large differences in terms of what teachers and educators are actually paid for the work that they do. Similar work which is all governed by the one quality standard. So same expectations. We're expecting a lot of teachers and educators in these settings, but there are differences in how they're recognised and differences in how they are paid. Let me give you an example. At my university, we provide early childhood teacher education courses that enable the teachers to graduate, and they can work with children birth to 8 years. That's how we define early childhood. So that means that these teachers, they're being trained over a 4-year period of time, and at the end when they graduate, they can choose to go left into a prior to school setting or right into the early years of school. Which way do you think most of them go? We were actually having around 60 to 70% at the moment who are heading into the school context. Now, lots of our students are telling us they really want to work in prior to school settings. That's where their passion is and that's what they want to be able to do. But at the moment, there is a difference of around about $25,000 to $30,000. I'm going to say that again, $25,000 to $30,000 if you go this way compared to that way. And we're asking these teachers who have been trained the same, who have done a rigorous 4-year course, to make a choice, and if they go this way, they're going to get much less pay. And that's in the first year. So that's not okay, and that's one of the ongoing impediments that we have actually got at the moment, because if we're wanting to attract more and more teachers to work in prior to school settings, we have to be addressing that, don't we? So we've been doing some research in terms of that, and it was really difficult to understand, what was happening and why is it that people are actually working in services in prior to school settings if they have this choice. So in one of our studies, we actually decided that we would flip the question, and instead of focusing on what was it that was causing teachers to leave prior to school settings, that we would flip it on its head and say, what is it that is retaining teachers? Because we know that there are teachers and educators who spend quite a lot of time in services. So why is that so? And what is it that is making the difference for them? And we were really quite surprised in this particular study about what we found. We found, not surprisingly, that passion for the work, that sense of importance and purpose, that sense of love for children and wanting to make a difference, that they were intrinsic rewards, and that the educators that we talked with just talked about that and said that they loved their work, they knew that it was important, and it made a really big difference to them and their sense of job satisfaction. That was one of the things that was keeping them in these prior to school services where they were getting paid less. Another key area, and also not surprising, particularly after Jessie's talk, is this focus on effective leadership and management practices. So again, we're talking with educators and teachers, and they're telling us that they love their centre because the leadership of the centre and all of the staff work together really well. Key things that came out of that was that everyone worked together, supported by leaders, to create an environment where it was fun to work and engaging to work. Part of that was that educators felt that they had voice, that they were able to exercise some voice in things like curriculum decision making and development of philosophies of the centre, that they had some opportunity to influence and shape those things. And that gave them a sense of belonging to the broader group and the ability to help make things even better at the service. There was also a focus on the fact that they had some voice in their rosters and their work conditions, and that their leaders were very supportive when they had family demands as well, so that if there was something on at the school that they wanted to go to see their child, that the service was family oriented and supported them as much as they could to do that. So this collegial and positive environment. What we did not expect to find was that, having told us all of this, educators also said, and the other reason that I can stay here and that I do stay here is my partner makes enough money. My family is supporting me. I still live at home. If I had to live out, I couldn't do this, but because I'm living at home, I can do that. So we discovered that these educators who are working incredibly hard and have passion for their job are actually financially subsidising the Australian early childhood system because they're accepting poor wages, because they're lucky, because they've got some extra financial support. Some of these educators were actually taking second jobs to keep going. So again, not okay. There have been multiple studies like that in Australia and around the world which are saying that we need to be doing something about this because love will only get us so far. Eventually, the reality of needing to make ends meet, cost of living pressures, and a fact of feeling a little bit used and unloved ourselves is going to see that workforce go. And that's certainly the trend that we're seeing. I wanted to draw attention to this particular photo, which was released only about a month or so ago after the Australian budget was announced. And it's interesting, it's 6 years after this particular study. Nothing's changed. These early childhood educators love their kids, but love won't pay the bills. One thing that is happening which is promising in Australia is that at last, after a very, very long period of time, the Australian government is considering and actively investigating wage subsidies. So I know that that's happened in other parts of the world, and certainly in Australia, all of the research is saying this is one of our number one, if not the number one problem that needs to be addressed. Anything else has to wait. We have to do something about this. And we are actually moving towards the potential for wage subsidies. So we're just hoping that that's going to continue to keep going, and that will be something I'll come back and report on next time. Okay, when we were doing some of the work that I was talking about before in terms of those biographical interviews with educators, and we were going into those particular 13 centres, the research team worked collectively, and when we went into some of those centres, we came out thinking some of these centres seem to be doing better in terms of creating a positive atmosphere and a supportive atmosphere than others. And it was just a sense. You'd go in and you'd talk with educators and you'd get their particular views, and you'd talk with leaders and get their views, and we would leave thinking, we think that this service is doing better than some of the other ones that we have looked at. And when we looked at some of the demographic information that we had collected, and we also did a satisfaction and morale questionnaire as well, it actually proved that we could actually see that in the centres where when we went in, we thought, wow, this has got a really nice feel to it and feels like it's working really well. We actually found that those particular services were rating much better in terms of job satisfaction and morale and retention. So in a follow-up study, we decided we wanted to go back in and go a little bit more deeply into that. So we used a selection measure to be able to identify what we called our top 3 centres in that particular collection data. And then we went back out to spend some more time with these particular leaders and educators to find out what it was that they thought was making a difference for them. And what we were trying to do was to get a 360-degree view of effective leadership in those centres. What were the leaders doing? What was happening that was working well for those particular services? So these particular things were highlighted, and again, there's quite a lot of synergy with some of the things that both Bridget and Jessie were talking about this morning. Interestingly, the educators talked about the fact that they admired their leaders because all of their leaders had experience and understanding working as educators and teachers. People talked about working up the ranks and that they had started perhaps as an assistant and that they had developed their career and their knowledge and skills. And that was appreciated by other educators because they felt that the leader knew what was the day-to-day work of educators and was able to support them better because they had that knowledge and experience. The leaders set high but achievable expectations. They knew what was reasonable. And interestingly, they set those expectations collaboratively. So it wasn't a hierarchical thing where the leader went in and said, right, here's my vision and here are my rules and my goals and this is what we're all going to do. It was a conversation that brought everyone together. And the leaders talked about the importance of that because they were still driving it and they were still ultimately responsible as the leaders, but the importance of bringing people on board and making sure that everyone's priorities were being considered and then choosing some priorities to move forward so that we have reasonable expectations. The educators talked about their leaders being approachable and accessible. And we noticed that in most of these services, the leaders spent a lot of time in the rooms. They weren't in an office somewhere. They were actually in the rooms, seeing what was happening and also working alongside of educators. Educators talked about feeling supported. They talked about being able to talk openly with their leader. And they also talked about really appreciating the emotional support and sometimes even the physical support if they were feeling tired, that the leader would step in and help them out. And all the while that was happening, the leader was modelling and coaching and mentoring quality practice. Now, we know that there's high demand on educators in early childhood education and care, and one of the key roles of the leaders was to manage that workload and to try and help educators manage that workload. In Australia, for a period of time, we've gone a bit crazy with documentation. There is this expectation that educators are going to be writing beautiful stories all of the time and taking photographs and mounting them and having an art show with all of this beautiful documentation around, which is fabulous, except incredibly time-consuming. And suddenly we realised, gosh, that's taking educators away from teaching and from interacting and building relationships and having positive experiences with children. Now, it's important, we must have some curriculum documentation. That's part of the professional work of teachers and educators. But it's about what's reasonable and are we providing time and support for the teachers and educators to do that? Or are they doing it at home, late at night or on weekends, and we're still paying them less than we should? So thinking about how we're supporting that. These particular leaders talked a lot about supporting professional interactions, the relationships and the interactions and the conversations between the educators, and providing opportunities for learning and for growth, so including promotional growth as well. And it was very, very clear that there was a great deal of respect for the importance of early childhood education and care amongst teams, and that the leaders really respected the people who were actually doing that. And they talked about the fact that their job was to enable teachers and educators to do their job. They saw themselves in that role. We have a focus in Australia on two particular streams of leadership. So I was talking there about leadership and management in terms of leading the service. With the introduction of the National Quality Framework, we've really strengthened our focus on pedagogical leadership. And that's not surprising. There's plenty of research that tells us how important it is that we have a strong leader who is guiding and supporting and mentoring and driving quality programs and practices in early childhood education and care. So for us, I think that the key motivation came from the Reggio Emilia idea with the pedagogista. Australia didn't like the idea of pedagogista or pedagogical leader, so we've gone with educational leader. And that particular role has evolved over a period of time and now is a very strong role. And some of our most recent research shows how important that is in actually driving quality improvement. Driving it only if the educational leader has the right professional knowledge and skills in terms of curriculum and pedagogy, but also the ability to lead in collaborative teams. So being able to generate that sense of everyone working together and everyone working for one particular goal. So I said that I was feeling optimistic, and certainly I'm an optimistic person, so I could be just blind in this regard as well, but I think optimism is the way to go. Australia has developed a national workforce strategy. And I just wanted to show you a little bit in terms of the areas. We've got 6 focal areas, and pleasingly, professional recognition, which includes pay and conditions for the very first time in Australia, is central to this particular strategy. You can also see that there's a big focus on data and evidence, and there is ongoing funding of research to inform the work that we're doing. And there is an evaluation plan around this, which is monitoring our progress towards. This is a 10-year plan. This is not something that we can do in 1 or 2 years. It's a 10-year plan, and at the end of that, we will only be on our way, I'm sure. So, in terms of where we are at the moment, we're looking at putting teachers and educators at the centre of the workforce ecosystem, because all of our lovely plans and aspirations are not going to happen unless we actually look after the people who are doing the most important work here. And what we're looking for is a sustainable, professional, skilled workforce that is sustainable and is of high quality. And in terms of an ecosystem, I think one of the key realisations is that no one part of the sector can do this. Government can't do it alone. Approved providers can't do it alone. Teachers and educators can't do it on their own. It needs to be shared responsibility and shared accountability. And that's where we need to be all working together, putting teachers and educators at the centre of the ecosystem and working to make things work for them. That's it. Thank you very much.
I have a question here. Just now you were asking a question as to how we can how can we describe ourselves? You were saying that we need to be empowered to have the skill to describe ourselves and our work. So we're not just like nose wipers, carers, right?
Absolutely.
And we are not implementers of curriculum. I'm talking about two ends of the two poles of the spectrum.
Yes.
So it begs a question, so how do we describe ourselves? I think one of the reasons why we're so underpaid, under-recognized, not understood is because of the range of work and services that we cover. And you were talking about, communicating to different people. We have to say, probably use different diction for different audiences. But if we are to have, let's say, 2 sentences in which we are to describe ourselves in our very professional work, what would it be?
Yes. You're asking me, what would it be?
Yes, indeed, because you've been thinking about this for so long and you pose the question. So is there a draft answer that you can provide?
No, there's not. I think that's something that has to come from inside each particular educator. But if I was responding, I would be talking about making a difference for young children. I would be talking about responding to a child's interest and helping them to think more deeply about something. I would talk about listening to children so that they know that I value what they're talking about. So I think it's just adding that little bit more on, not thinking that people are going to know what you're talking about or anticipate that there's a lot more thinking behind what you're doing. It's just that little bit on. We call it an elevator pitch in Australia. So it's about thinking for yourself, what's your elevator pitch? If you've got 1 or 2 minutes, how are you going to describe yourself and the work that you do?
That's excellent. Way. That's the answer I'm looking for. Thank you.
Actually, I'm very, very curious. You spoke a little bit about the diversity and Indigenous population, and I'm curious, in the new programs that this 10-year plan and some of the new initiatives that seem to be, that your country seems to be embarking on, I'm curious about the extent to which there is consideration of cultural diversity and the extent to which maybe some of those cultural beliefs might also be playing a part in terms of the difficulties of recruiting and retaining, teachers. And I guess in particular, I ask about that because I do think, and I believe you mentioned something about, that we know that it is important to try and recruit a diverse workforce. And I suspect that there might be some culture-related reasons why in diversity recruitment might also pose a challenge. So I wonder if you could speak to that issue.
Look, I think absolutely. I think that we've been operating from one particular cultural perspective for a very long time. And when I look at that across the ecosystem, there are many things, many levers that we're needing to look at. So we've certainly started to look at teacher education. So, some of the entry requirements into teacher education can be really quite a barrier for different cultural groups. I've had colleagues from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds who've also talked to me about the need for us to be really thinking about the whiteness and imperialness of university contexts, basically, and our need to think about how we're going to make them much more welcoming and relevant spaces for different cultural groups. These are ideas at the moment. We haven't solved any of these problems. And I think that it's also just about making sure that the work speaks to the priorities and quality contexts that these diverse colleagues bring to us, and that we're providing culturally safe and responsive environments for them to work in. So it's a work in progress, but there's a lot more conversation about that now. And a lot of the policy work is really, this is where I think policy is important. The policy is putting in levers for that. So in the recent update of our national curriculum, strengthening Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, recognising ancient knowledges as part of our theoretical and research base, thinking about the concept of cultural responsiveness, where in the past we've thought about competence. Well, that's not enough. We actually want to put the competence into play and have responsive services. All of those things are important.